Welcome to the Pod of Inquiry, pushing the envelope for human understanding and optimization, the podcast for podiatrists. The Pod of Inquiry is designed to empower you with knowledge. What happens from there is up to you. Your host, Dr. Stephen Barrett, has designed this show to take you down some very deep rabbit holes, hopefully bringing you back out again, relatively unscathed, but cerebrally whipped, enabling a better understanding of all things worthy of inquiry. If you have more questions after the show, then that is good. The new discovery today many times was the new discovery 50 years ago, only to be suppressed or plainly ignored. Medicine and surgery can sometimes take a long while to get their paradigm shifted. We hope to have a lot of fun on this show and maybe destroy some ridiculous dogma along the journey. Thanks for joining the show today. Let's start spelunking.
Hello, everyone. This week's guest is Dr. Bill Lear, who is a Mohs surgeon and dermatologist and has published over 50 peer-reviewed publications on skin surgery and reconstruction. In 2015, after recognizing the lack of effective tools to manage and prevent adverse surgical outcomes, he co-founded the company called Suture Guard Medical to create solutions for this problem. He founded and is the program director of an ACGME accredited Mohs surgery fellowship program, and he has performed over 30,000 Mohs surgeries in his career. This is a great conversation because not only do we talk about the very innovative devices that he has developed, which makes our lives as surgeons that much easier, but we talk about some fundamental surgical concepts that will improve your wound closures in surgery. Without any further introduction, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Bill Lear. All right, good morning. I'm here with Dr. Bill Lear, and we're going to talk about some of his very innovative advancements for wound closure, and I know that will resonate well with a lot of the audience. I can't tell you over my surgical career, one of the most frustrating things had to be wound dehiscence, and it could, like, you talk about the ultimate downpour on something that was great intraoperatively. Well, a wound dehiscence is just that. So, Dr. Lear, tell us about how you came to develop some of these things, and then we'll get into the nuances after that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Stephen. This is a real pleasure. So the idea for all this came when I had been writing a textbook chapter for a major dermatology book that's used a lot by residents and fellows. It's called Surgery of the Skin. And I was asked to write a chapter on suture materials and surgical equipment. And so in writing this chapter, I came across a lot of literature, actually engineering literature, which related to strength of wounds and suturing techniques and suture materials. And as I was writing it, I started to think about holes in my own practice and my own specialty with what I was learning. And so anyway, shortly after the book had been published, I was holding my daughter, who was 3 months old at the time. And it was the middle of the afternoon, I was sketching a desk, and I thought to myself, like, a lot of times wounds break open because the sutures fail. They either tear through the skin or the deep suture breaks down inside. But I thought to myself, like, whoa, like, there are suture bridges, like there are abdominal suture bridges that are used in general surgery. And I thought, well, boy, I wonder if I could make one of those. A little one, that I could use in my skin cancer surgeries. And that would keep the suture above the skin. I could use a nice burly nylon suture that's not going to break down. And so I started sketching them. And so I put my daughter down, and then I went downstairs and I said to my wife, we've got a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old. It's a perfect time to start a medical device company. Right. And so we did some patent searches and basically launched a company. I went to a pitch competition and won the pitch competition, and that was kind of the energy, the fuel that we needed to start it. That's now our legacy product. It's not our main product, but that's how the company got its start.
Okay. So now your experience in Mohs surgery, you guys leave some pretty big holes when you do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I run a fellowship program. I have my ninth fellow this year, um, up here in Oregon. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll operate from the foot to the scalp, and we make small, tiny to huge holes in people. Um, and so actually the original product was used a lot in scalp wounds. So scalp wounds, scalp skin will move till it doesn't move. That's what I like to tell the fellow. You'll get a little bit of stretch out of scalp skin, but when it stops moving, it stops moving. To get 1 extra millimeter is going to incite too much tension, and you'll get a lot of edge necrosis. And so anyway, the original suture bridge that I developed, we use that in scalp surgery, and I still use that to get creep. And so, as many of your audience will know, creep is when you put a material under stress, and then over a period of time, it will naturally deform. It will naturally creep, and so it will essentially stretch out and stay stretched out. And so, scalp skin does that quite efficiently. You can get a 65% reduction in tension for a given deformation in scalp within 30 minutes.
Wow.
Which is perfect for Mohs, because that's about how long it takes to process a Mohs piece.
Okay.
And so I went from doing 20 or 30% scalp flaps down to pretty much zero scalp flaps. And then on the opposite end of the body was the leg. And that original device was not as well tolerated on the leg because the skin is thinner, it tears more easily. There's a lot more fluid exudate. And so in using the original device on the leg, I realized it needs to have different properties, and it had to be adhesive. And that's why it's called an adhesive suture retention device, the first device, the HemiGuard ASRD, because that was the classification of the first device. And really the second device was meant to be the embodiment of a suture retention device, but it had to be adhesive, because if it weren't adhesive, you get fluid underneath it.
Right.
And that fluid, when it traps, would get macerated.
Mm-hmm. So just so the audience is clear, when you refer to the first device versus the second device, what are you specifically talking about there?
Right. So the first device, which is really a legacy device, is a little suture bridge. And it's a little, it looks like a bridge. If you think about a little span, it kind of has a little bump in the middle, and it actually is what the Suture Guard logo is based on. So one day, I realized, we need to have a Suture Guard logo, and I basically just took the outline of the original device, which was the Suture Guard, what we call ISR now, intraoperative skin relaxation device, and I just did a rough outline on it, and then I sent it to one of these graphic design companies where they'll do a logo for you for $100. And I said, can you turn this into our logo? And so they did. And so anyway, if you look at the Suture Guard logo, you'll see that it looks kind of like a wave, kind of like a swirl. And that's what the original device looked like. That device is mostly sold to dermatologists now because of the success of our second device, which was the HemiGuard ASRD, the adhesive suture retention device.
Okay.
And then we have a third device out, which we could talk about, called the HemiGuard Interlock, which is a punctureless version of the ASRD. So our main product, which is the HemiGuard ASRD, and the one that most foot and ankle surgeons would be using, also vascular surgeons use it, dermatologists use it. That's a device where you put a strip down on each side of the wound, and the strips are 6 centimeters long. And there are 3 zones. There's a zone that's closest to the wound that is very stiff. Then there's a middle zone that's less stiff. And there's a trailing zone that is got the least stiffness. It's very, very stretchy.
Okay.
And so if you were to take, it's an age-old trick in dermatology that if you have thin skin, you just take a steri strip and you sew through it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that bolsters the skin edge. The problem with that is that whatever force you put on the leading edge also goes on the trailing edge. And so you get a trailing blister. You get a shear force on the trailing edge that blisters. Plus, the steri strip often falls off because of the adhesion properties and whatnot. So effectively what HemiGuard ASRD is taking that trick, but coming up with a version that we designed with biomedical engineers and material specialists to really take that concept and make the idealized version of that. So with HemiGuard, you've got those three zones: the stiffest by the wound, the less stiff middle, and the least stiff on the trailing edge. You suture through holes that are in the leading edge, the one closest to the wound and the one that's stiffest. And then you go through the holes through full thickness skin, and then through full thickness skin and holes on the other side, and then you tie it. There are two holes in each, so you can either use a simple interrupted, or you can use a vertical mattress suture.
Okay.
And some surgeons prefer one and some the other.
Right.
So the use of ASRD always involves the use of the suture going through full thickness skin.
Okay.
What we have found that the ASRD does is not only does it prevent tearing of the skin, because it's essentially like if you took a tarp and you reinforce the holes of the tarp is not going to tear. You've reinforced it so it doesn't tear. So we've shown that there's a great resilience to skin tearing when you use the HemiGuard ASRD. But perhaps even more importantly, is we did studies looking at perfusion. And so if you compare a normal percutaneous suture to a percutaneous suture that's been bolstered with HemiGuard ASRD, when you bolster with HemiGuard ASRD, you get 25% better wound edge perfusion with the HemiGuard. And that's simply because you're dispersing that stress further away from the wound.
And that perfusion has to be, it's a critical thing, because as we know in the lower extremity, the wound looks great at the time of closure, and then they get up and they become a little bit more edematous, and now your suture either tears through the skin or you get this ischemogenic phenomena where it just necroses around the suture itself. That's really a great way to disperse pressure. I would think that it would have been more than 25%. Based on some of the images that you have on your website. It looked like those were perfusion images, and it looked like dramatically different.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the image, it's dramatically different, and it depends on how you take the colorimetric assays, and and again, that was data, I think, from about 20 patients, and mostly on lower extremity and on truncal wounds. But it is a dramatic difference when you look at the pictures, and it turns out to be about a 25% absolute perfusion improvement.
I want to talk about creep a little bit, because it's something that we see, and a lot of times we'll see reverse creep in the lower extremity. You'll make an incision, you'll do whatever you're doing, and then all of a sudden it's just like, I can't bring this wound back together. It was perfectly together, and that extremity hasn't become edematous intraoperatively during that short period of time. It's almost like the skin just kind of contracts down. When you were talking about scalp wounds, that's very interesting that you hit this point where it just won't extend or close anymore, but then you hold that for about 30 minutes and then you get a little bit more closure. Is that what I understood you to say?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So with scalp, if you look at a stress relaxation, so like a force versus elongation curve for the skin on scalp, you'll see that you get a fair bit of elongation at low force. It just goes long, and then all of a sudden hits a wall, where to get another millimeter along the elongation axis, you need 10 newtons more force to get that extra millimeter or two. And so if you look like molecularly at what's going on there, most of the collagen fibers in the dermis kind of look like X's. So like there's scissors that are like kind of like crossed like that. But then as you pull that skin, those collagen fibers start to parallelize. They start to become more parallel. And then at some point, they've just become too parallel. But there's a relaxation phenomenon where when you let those collagen fibers relax, they can then pull apart a little bit extra. And so that's really what we're doing with the intraoperative skin relaxation device on scalp, is we're really just giving those collagen fibers time to realign and relax and stretch out, and then pulling them apart a little bit more gradually with time.
Do you
and on the lower extremity, while you can't use the ISR to do that, you can use ASRD to do that. So with ASRD, where you put the adhesive device down on each side and then you sew through it, if you can't get that wound together at time zero, let's say, you can leave that wound for 20 minutes or a half an hour or a day. And then you can go back and you can get a little more motion out of it. And then
Hmm.
you can leave it another day and you'll get a little more motion out of it. And so we have some surgeons. We have one surgeon, Nathan Graves in Indiana, and he used to be an Eagle Scout, and he's very adept at doing knots. And so he
Right.
uses these special knot configurations where at day zero, he'll use a knot that's very easy to untie and then retie. And so he'll have the wound maybe this close together. And then on the next day, he'll undo that knot and retighten that knot and go a little tighter and a little tighter. And again, so he's using that creep or stress relaxation phenomenon on lower extremity using the ASRD.
Yeah, I think there's something out there on the market that is kind of like a continual, and I used it probably 5, 10 years ago, where it has these little hooks, these little barbs that would hook into the skin.
Dermaclose.
Yeah, dermaclose. And that's kind of a similar concept.
Dermaclose is a similar. So yeah, with dermaclose, you take metal clips that almost look like picture hangers
Hmm.
to me. But you take these little metal clips and then you staple, usually staple, but I think you can suture them in the skin. And then there's this little attachment that's like the size of a mouse almost that you'd use with your computer, and it's got a little dial on it.
Right.
And you take the loop from this and you attach it to the metal things that are attached into the skin. Um, and it applies 11 to 12 newtons of force in closing the wound. So it's a relatively small amount of force. And then you basically, after many days of 11 newtons of force, you're getting progressive creep on the wound. When we did our study with ISR on scalp, we were applying more in the range of 20 to 25 newtons. And so that's why we were able to get such big gains in small amounts of time. Um, but with dermaclose, where that's something that is applied for long periods of time, I think they found that 11 newtons was the number that they wanted to go with.
Now, in the scalp, are you undermining a little bit too to give yourself a little bit more of a sliding ability, or
Yeah. So that's a great topic. So um, on the scalp, I will undermine a little bit, but I am in general not a large undermining fan. And it's so in dermatology, for instance, if you want to talk about coding for a second, so if we are closing a wound in dermatology, let's say I did an excision of a melanoma. And so then there's a hole that has to be closed up, and I'm going to do a linear closure. I can either do a simple, intermediate, linear, um, simple, I should say, linear closure, intermediate linear closure, or complex linear closure. Simple, intermediate, and complex. And the main way that people code reason they code a complex closure is that they've done extensive undermining. And there's a few other reasons, but the most common is extensive undermining. And extensive undermining means that you've undermined the entire length of the wound for the width of the wound. So even though it's an ellipse, you take the maximum diameter of the wound. Let's say that's 3 centimeters for a
right?
typical melanoma. Okay. So even though the dog ears have very little diameter, you take that 3 centimeters and you undermine the whole length. So that's what you need to do to build that code. Now, when you're undermining, you're creating a lot of potential for hematoma,
Hmm.
seroma. It takes a lot of time. You've got to cauterize under there. And then you're also devascularizing to some
Right.
extent the wound edge.
Hmm.
And so there's great papers on this actually in animal models where they took pigs and they undermined extensively. They did exact definition. They basically, I mean, this was before the CPT definition, I think, but because the CPT definition has recently changed, but they did the CPT definition of extensive undermining. They took the width of the wound and then did undermining for that width for the whole length. And they compared it to stress relaxing the wound without undermining. And they found that the addition, and then they did the two together, and they found that the addition of the undermining added virtually nothing. There was no statistical difference in how easy it was to get the wound closed, but
Right.
the amount of complications was dramatically higher in terms of edge necrosis and in terms of wound dehiscence, and in terms of seroma and hematoma. And so I personally, like when I finished fellowship, I did it how I was told to do and how many dermatologists do it, which is I did a lot of undermining. I did a lot of deep sutures, which I do less of now. Um, and um, and then gradually I had a few wounds where for whatever reason I didn't undermine it. Maybe I didn't have
Right.
time. And I saw the wounds back and I was like, boy, this did really well even without undermining. And so it's a great topic. It's not one terribly related to wholly related to suture guard, but I have become a lot less of a fan of undermining with time.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I used to be kind of a contrarian, I think, in that. But now when I go to meetings, I'm kind of I feel like I'm more in the norm on that, where there's a lot of people who are kind of undermining a lot less. Because again, you get so many complications. And interestingly, the other way you can code for a complex linear is by using a suture retention device. And so
Okay.
a lot of dermatologists now will use HemiGuard. And in fact, in one of our main electronic health records, which is called EMMA by Modernizing Medicine, if you click the box for complex linear, one of the first questions you're asked is, did you use a HemiGuard?
Okay.
And if you did, they know, okay, well, that codes for it. Because again, just like that paper in pigs, stress relaxation gives you the same effect, if not better than undermining, but with less complications, because you haven't gone in with a blade and cut
Right.
all of those potential blood sources that both, one, can bleed and cause a hematoma, and two, are devascularizing the wound edge. So, I've been teaching my fellows now for 9 years, don't undermine so much. And in the beginning, that was kind of, they were kind of renegades, if you will, within the Mohs College. But now it's more, I would say it's more in line with what a lot of people are doing. So
I think you make a great point about using less deep sutures. I know I've been doing what I've been doing for about 37 years now. And the way we were taught back in the day in the residency is you got to put a ton of sutures in the subcutaneous space and all this other stuff. And it's like, we stopped doing a lot of that and the people got better. They had less foreign material in there. You close the deep structures, oppose them well, but not over the top. And the body takes care of quite a bit. But we found that we actually got a lot less hypertrophy to our scars when we eliminated those subcutaneous. Now, I will put in intradermal sutures, but again, sparingly with, something small like a 5/0 monocryl or something like that. But with your device, I would think that you see a noticeable improvement in the quality of the scar as well. Because when you have a hypoperfusion, that's going to lead to more dystrophic collagen formation in that early postoperative period. And
yeah.
so by taking that tension off, you're going to, the fibroblast isn't so challenged, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot in what you just said that I really like and resonates with me. I guess number one, and I'm gonna take a few points here, but like number one, in terms of deep suture, a few years ago when Suture Guard first started out, I had a lot of questions. Like I had said when I wrote that textbook chapter and just reflecting on my own practice, and like you said, how I was taught to do it. I realized there were certain things I was told that aren't necessarily backed up by science. They were just kind of like what people thought we should do,
Right.
well-meaning people thought we should do. Um, and so one of the first studies we actually did was nothing related to our device. We took Yucatan hairless pigs. We did this here at Oregon State University with a friend of mine, Katie Townsend, who's a veterinarian, and Duncan Townsend, who's her husband. And so we took these pigs, we did full thickness incisions on them, 2 inches long, and we either put 2O Vicryl, like beefy Vicryl in
Right.
there, or no Vicryl at all.
All right.
And then we take some nylon, and then we let them heal for 10 days or 42 days. And then we cut out that whole scar with a segment along it so that we could put it in a tensiometer. And we ripped the scars open because we wanted to see
Right.
how much strength did a bunch of beefy Vicryl sutures add at 10 days and 42 days. None. At day 10, there was no difference whether there was a Vicryl in the wound or not, like after you took out the nylon.
Right.
And at day 42, there was a trend that they were weaker. And it's
Mm.
like, well, why would they be weaker? Well, if you go and do Mohs surgery, and I do this all the time, I'll do Mohs surgery on a wound. So one of the criteria for Mohs is somebody does an excision, but there's a positive margin.
Right.
And so then I will go and I will cut out that whole length of scar and I'll do Mohs on it. And I will see deep suture. And what do I see around deep suture is a mass of granuloma.
Mm-hmm.
And granuloma is just a bunch of histiocytes. It's like apple jelly. You could just take a curette and just scrape it. It's a space-occupying lesion where there could otherwise be collagen.
Mm-hmm.
And so histologically, we found, not only is the 3O Vicryl or 2O Vicryl not adding any strength, but in fact, there's a reason to think it's making wounds weaker.
Mm.
And acting as a foreign body. And especially if you're doing it like in foot and ankle, sometimes in the context of very compromised circulation and diabetes and maybe not infection, but definitely not clean.
Yep.
So for me, that was a practice changing finding, to see
Yeah.
that not only is it okay to use less deep suture, but it's maybe preferential
Right.
to use less deep suture.
Well, I've never been a big fan of Vicryl, to tell you. I saw so much of it spit out by
Yes.
non-allergenic patients that we really discontinued it almost. Well, we'll use it for a capsule once in a while, but for anything else, we discontinued it and went to monocryl, which seemed to be a lot less reactive for these folks. And then we evolved the same as you did. We less Vicryl, or excuse me, less monocryl as we would go on. So so there's a lot to be said about that study. I would love to link that in the show notes because this is a debate that I have sometimes with my fellows. It's like, they're closing things up. It's like, what, you're putting a whole bunch of foreign material in there. Let's back up here a little bit, do what you need to do, and let the body heal itself. And
I think that's where it's at. I mean, I think that, we are, for however many years humans have been around, and I don't know the number. I'm not, that's not my forte, if you will, but it's a long time. And it definitely predates closing wounds with suture. But, humans have adapted to be out in the wilds, getting cut, getting injured, getting wounds, probably fairly big wounds, and then healing it up. And I think I think sometimes as surgeons, and we're so well-meaning in it.
Right.
We want to do the right thing, but I think sometimes we forget that unless the body is very, very compromised with end-stage diabetes and maybe on a host of, organ rejection drugs because they had a transplant or whatever else. I think for a lot of people, their bodies are able to heal themselves. And it's like a Goldilocks principle almost. It's like, put enough support. Like, I ask every time I have a new resident, I say to them, what is a wound closure? And they won't tell me what it is. They'll tell me what it's for. Oh, it's to make the wound look good, or it's to close. It's an external support to a wound that supports the wound until the wound has adequate inherent strength to withstand the forces placed on it.
Before we continue with this great discussion, I just want to take a quick break to acknowledge this week's sponsor. Several years ago, I chose Alpinion as my ultrasound brand of choice after years of experience and research into ultrasound imaging. In fact, I have 2 of their machines. Alpinion has incredible precision and penetration built into their technology that, in my opinion, is simply the best value in all of the ultrasound imaging space. They have several price points to meet your needs, and I can tell you definitively that you'll end up having to pay double to achieve the equivalent imaging quality from other top brands. That doesn't even account for the unlimited software updates and remote tech support included with no monthly fees. Right now, to show their appreciation for the listeners of the Pod of Inquiry, they're offering an incredible discount. Their portable i7 retails for $21,000, but you can get it discounted at most medical meetings for $19,000. But my listeners will get it discounted to $15,900. This has never been offered anywhere for the new portable system with the engine of a console system. Use code SBPOI to take advantage of this incredible offer. You won't be disappointed with Alpinion. I sure haven't been.
And that external support, in my opinion, should have a Goldilocks principle to it. It's enough support to keep the wound closed, but not so much that there's foreign material and excess inflammation and suffocating the wound with extra sutures. So to me, it really is a Goldilocks of like, yes, and I think that's the right message to the fellow is, yeah, get the wound closed. Yeah, and we're not like, oh my God, like don't put any foreign material in the dermis at all, but put enough to get it closed reasonably, and then, close the top layer on it. I like to say, like, I do a lot of flaps, like a lot of facial flaps. And I like to tell the fellow, use the fewest number of sutures to get the flap looking as good as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, for instance, like a bilo, you should have 3 sutures, and it should look like I could just glue the wound.
Right.
Like, because you put the sutures so judiciously where the tension points are that it's almost like, wow, like, I mean, I could have like a first year medical student come in, and finish it up. And I think when they go in with that mentality, they're not just willy-nilly just going along like a sewing machine with them. They're really saying, aha, that's a point of tension. And the point of the closure is to relieve that tension. And so I will put one there and I'll put one there. And, 3 or 4 stitches later, if they have that mindset, then the wound always, to me, the wound always will look better because every suture is making a meaningful difference then, to the closure.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that when I was looking at your website and, kind of looking at a couple of the videos, which I thought your videos were very good on your website. So anybody that's listening to this wants to go and learn how to do this, your videos are great. But one of the things is that you don't want to get this wet for 5 days. And I'm assuming that's just because of the adhesive nature of the device itself.
Yes. Yeah, I find, so personally, in my practice and with my patients, I find it best to tell them to keep it dry for 5 to 7 days. Because if the device lacks adhesiveness and the adhesion fails, then it will just recoil into the wound. And it's not offloading. And in fact, it could even be deleterious to the wound because then you've just got extra things that are doing nothing on the wound. So it's got to stay clean and dry, in my opinion, for 5 to 7 days. Now, that being said, there are surgeons out there using the things I made and using and not doing what I say and getting good results. And so I think that's where, regional variations can come into play. For instance, one of my former fellows, my second fellow, so with grafts, I like to bolster them and I use Xeroform and as a bolster. But when he went to Florida, he found that was just too macerating. It was too humid down there. It just wasn't working for him. And so he switched to adaptic bolsters. And that worked for him, right?
Right.
And so, I think when it comes to keeping it dry, definitely I would say drier is better. But I think that's part of the recipe that's dependent on, maybe where you are. So like, maybe you could get away with a different level of keeping it dry, if you will, in Arizona than here in Oregon, where it's
Right.
admittedly pretty wet. And so that might account for some of that regional difference. But yeah, it's best that they be kept dry. The newer HemiGuard, the newest HemiGuard, the HemiGuard Interlock, which doesn't use any suture. Instead, it relies on a very strong hook and loop mechanism to close. That one has a newer adhesive because, again, because there's no suture with it, we had to use a stronger adhesive with it.
Right.
Um, and so that one is more water tolerant than the existing HemiGuard ASRD. And that one is used mostly by plastics, but also used by foot and ankle surgeons in between HemiGuard ASRDs. And that one I find you can get wet a little bit more than the HemiGuard ASRD. In fact, for HemiGuard Interlock, when I was developing it, I was learning to scuba dive.
Okay.
And so I would put the adhesive under my wetsuit and it would be wet for hours and hours and hours and hours. And it would do fine with it.
What about some of the folks that are like super allergic to things? They've got the quote tape allergy.
Yeah.
Is that something that you put in top of your mind before you maybe apply something with a lot of adhesive?
Yes. Well, I'm a dermatologist, so I'm always aware. I'm always thinking,
That's why
allergies.
I asked you the question.
So number one, like most contact dermatitis to tape is irritant. It's not true allergic contact dermatitis. But there definitely is. I mean, there definitely is acrylate allergy. I mean, acrylate allergy is one of the, I think it's probably in the top 20 contact allergens. The adhesives on both HemiGuard ASRD and HemiGuard Interlock are acrylic based. Now, they're different acrylates, and there are so many different acrylate adhesives that it's difficult. It's so difficult for a patient to come in and say, oh, I have an acrylate allergy. Well, because acrylate, as you remember from organic chemistry, is just a little, acetate group on what could be an otherwise huge molecule. And so what I will say about them is the adhesives that are used in both HemiGuard ASRD and HemiGuard Interlock were not proprietary to us. We did not develop those materials. Rather, we use those materials that are commercially available. And both materials are used very extensively in glucose monitoring. So on those glucose monitors, like Dexcom and things like that, they use adhesive. And I am very thankful that they had put reams and reams and reams of research into developing extremely hypoallergenic materials. I have used HemiGuard ASRD literally hundreds of times. I rarely see irritant contact dermatitis. I've not seen any allergic contact dermatitis. The most common skin complication I see from HemiGuard ASRD is maceration if they don't keep it dry. And that's the reason to keep it dry, because the part of HemiGuard ASRD that's closest to the wound edge is the part that's most likely to lift slightly off the skin. And so any water would get under that. And so then they could have some maceration. Now, maceration is not the end of the world. It's just when I take them off, I like the skin to look just perfect.
Right.
Just like nothing was even there. And so maceration detracts from that, I'll say, the theater of the removal, where you remove it and the patient's like, wow, that looks great. Another point on that too is, and related to acrylate, is one of my favorite things, at least in dermatology, to do with HemiGuard ASRD is to use glue. And so a really classic way for me to use HemiGuard ASRD would be, so first off, I don't start with deeps with HemiGuard ASRD. I would put the HemiGuard ASRD down, open wound, take 2O nylon, and then close the wound. The HemiGuard ASRD, if you're thinking of it like building a house, is the foundation and the 2x4s of that house. Then I will add, I do still believe in deep sutures to some extent. Then I put in 2 or 3 dermal absorbables
Mm-hmm.
just to get that wound looking whipped straight and nice. And then I glue it. I
Right.
don't use any more top sutures. And I do that for 2 reasons. Number one, patients, generally speaking, patients like glued wounds. They feel like it's going to be aesthetically superior to a sutured wound.
Right.
I tend to agree. Um, Two, acrylate glues, so like Liquiband and Dermabond, are antimicrobial. While they might not have that as claims, it's well known that it's antimicrobial
Right.
alone. Um, and number three is it cuts down on exudate that in turn keeps the Hemigard ASRD dry.
Right. Now,
So it's a two-way, it's a symbiotic almost relationship with glue.
I want to talk about that because one of the, we don't see this often, but in the lower extremity, and I specialize almost all in nerve surgery. So, uh, one of the things that we'll see is we get these people, in most cases, they're up walking that same day. Well, at at that expense, there's a lot of gravitational pull, a lot of edema. And sometimes we'll get even some venous bleeding, even though we're pretty meticulous with our hemostasis intraoperatively. And I've seen a few wounds that were what I called too perfectly closed, that the exudate or the blood couldn't get out. And all of a sudden, there's been now a hematoma that wouldn't have been there if it was allowed to have some egress and get out of there. Now, it's not as big of a deal up in the face and the head and the neck and that type of thing because of just simply gravity, I think. But, and I've also seen a couple of disastrous situations where pain pumps had been used and the fluid had nowhere to go. And it just kind of overloaded and they ended up with a wicked necrosis. But I do kind of agree with you that the more pristine you can get the closure, certainly the patient perceives that better. And that usually does translate to when it's 4 weeks down the line, boy, this wound's looking really good versus one that's looking so-so.
Yeah.
But that I think is just something that happens occasionally. And, I remember one case that one of my earliest fellows did. He closed this, it was a tarsal tunnel. And he closed this up with a running intradermal suture, the whole, from stem to stern. And a couple days later, lady's getting a hematoma. And I said, well, just, pop one stitch and drain the hematoma and we'll be fine. Well, guess what? Couldn't do it because it was one. Yeah. And then all of a sudden now we've got the alligator that's got its mouth open rather than just a small little, maybe a millimeter, 2 millimeters of dehiscence. So you have to, sometimes the greatest enemy of good is better.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that expression.
Man, I tell you, it takes you a long time in the OR to learn that. But, because all surgeons are perfectionists at the time that they should be perfectionists while they're in the operating room. I mean, I wouldn't want a surgeon who wasn't a perfectionist in that arena working on me. But at the same time, sometimes you just have to have that clinical experience to say, no, this is enough. Like you made the point with the amount of suture material that's really required. This is a tangential comment because when we talk a lot of times with new trainees and whatnot about when can you get a wound wet. Now let's talk about a wound that we're not using with suture guard, something like that.
Yeah.
We were taught way back in the day, they got to stay dry until the stitches are out and blah, blah, blah. And, I let my patients literally shower the next day if it's a small incision and, a little soap and water and bait it out. And we haven't really experienced any more clinical infections with that than you want to comment on that from a dermatology standpoint?
Absolutely. So for me, my standard is, if I'm doing a flap or a primary closure, they keep the dressing on that day and then they shower the next day.
Right.
They shower the area. They don't scrub the area necessarily, but they shower the area. And I think it has a lot of, I think any potential negative is far outweighed by the positives because, you think about that wound the next day, virtually 90 something percent of those wounds are going to have blood and crust
Right.
around the edges. And getting in the shower is a really gentle, quote, natural way of cleaning it
Mm-hmm.
and getting rid of it. I like to say all the time, like water's the universal solvent, right?
Right. Yep.
And so even if they don't put soap, I don't really think it needs direct soap. I tell people not to directly soap it, but I definitely we have them shower. And I find the people who shower less after the wound have more problems than the people who do shower. Definitely.
Yeah.
The only exception to that for me is when I do skin grafts. So like a top, like I take some
Right.
skin from a clavicle and stitch it down somewhere. Um, with those people, I do have them keep it dry. But that's only because I'm often putting a
Right.
bolster on it.
Yeah.
And I'm also afraid they would rub it.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
You
afraid
don't.
they
You're
put
you're
shear force.
you're not wanting to interrupt that neovascularization and the incorporation of that
Right,
graft. Yeah. No,
right,
I understand that for
right. Because
sure.
grafts have a totally
Yeah.
different kind of like healing biochemistry and stuff. So, but that's the only one.
Okay.
Um, all others, I mean, my typical day, I do 15 Mohs surgeries and I've done 30,000 of them now. And that is my absolute standard. And I am 100% in line with you on that shower the next day. Don't scrub it,
Right.
but just being in the shower and that universal solvent of water cleaning it, I'm convinced that is the best thing for the wounds.
So one other thing I wanted to ask you, this is a little bit tangential, but one of the considerations that we have in wound closures, we want to give the ultimate cosmetic result that we can for that patient. And sometimes that result's subordinated by other factors that are much more important. I get that. Have you had any experience using some of the peptides? Like we're using thymosin beta-4 now for reduction of scar tissue, particularly in revision nerve cases where we've had a lot of scarring before.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be pretty interesting. And the cost is minimal for a patient. But do you have any experience with some of the peptides and helping
I
accelerate the
don't
closures?
in dermatology there's been kind of a push to use more like some biologics, like mimetics type products and Kerasis and things like that. But that's
Right.
mostly for second intent wounds.
Right.
Um, I think when you look at the mechanism by which hypertrophic scar happens, which is that, there are fibroblasts that have mechanical sensation in them. There
Right.
are fibroblasts that know amazingly, like our bodies are just so amazing. Again, our body, the wound knows whether it's under tension or not. And if it's under tension, these mechanical receptors will go in overdrive.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the longest time, people would say like, oh, keloids are from excess, TGF beta, transforming growth factor beta. But that's not what it's from. It's from the fact that fibroblasts have become overactivated, making more TGF beta. And why do they become activated? Well, they become activated because they're under tension.
Right.
So to me, when I think about scar reduction, I think number one, I do think there's a role for peptides and for autologous chemicals and things like that. But to me, the holy grail of it, I think, is offloading.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we're going with interlock is in plastic surgery. Uh, we have quite a few plastic surgeons now using abdominoplasty and breast reduction, where they're using it in places where sometimes the scars are not easy to look nice in a reproducible way just because there's so much tension.
Right.
And so with the interlock, what they're doing is they're basically doing the normal closure they would do. So unlike with Hemigard ASRD, where you really kind of have to change up what you're doing to a certain extent, With interlock, you can just do the normal closure that you would normally do, but then you get this beefy offloading with the interlock, where you
Right.
put down on each side and then use the hook and loop, and then you're just manually in a very direct way. So there have been other devices, like you think about the zip line, right, which got bought out by Stryker. That had something where you could adjust tension, but it didn't have differential stiffness. It couldn't take a load. So what we really wanted to do with interlock was do something where we could offload tension from the wound with the intent. Now, we don't have claims around scarring. I've done scarring studies, and it's a long road to get to a scarring study, because you need minimum 3 to 6 month endpoints. But anecdotally from the plastic surgeons who are using interlock, they do find that the scars are looking better. You might be familiar with, there's a product called Embrace, which was used in the plastic surgery market. And Embrace was basically an offloading device that you would put on the wound, an adhesive offloading device you'd put on the wound, but the wound had to be healed.
Okay.
So basically you could only start using it at 14 days. Well, we know biochemically that's not going to work, because those fibroblasts, they are activated
right at day one.
Right. Yeah, right. Hours. Exactly. Right. I mean, they're ready to roll. And so by day 14, you've kind of like that train left 2 weeks ago. Right. And so with HemiGuard interlock, it allows plastic surgeons to kind of get a head start on what they would otherwise do with Embrace. And if they want to use Embrace after, then that's great. Like, it would be a great segue for them. So with scarring, I really think that, like, the number one thing is offloading the tension. And again, that's where well-meaning surgeons in the past have said, well, let's use dermal sutures to offload the tension. But the problem with it is there's still tension.
Right.
That dermal suture itself, that little circle that's enveloping that little bit of dermis is still under a lot of tension, and it's still probably activating those fibroblasts.
Right.
So, unless you're creating some external thing, which is literally, like, one of my fellows has said it best. She said, using HemiGuard ASRD is like having an assistant push the wound together for 2 weeks.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. Empirically, I think 100%. And, one of the reasons I was fascinated by thymosin beta-4 is because we would do all of these things empirically, try to reduce the tension, try to decrease the scarring, and then doing a little research, it appears that, and I'm not a biochemist or anything like that, but evidently the thymosin beta-4 upregulates the fibroblast, which you would think that's a little counterintuitive. By upregulating something, you would think you would have more deposition of scarring, but it actually is the opposite of that. So, and I've talked to a couple of plastic surgeon friends of mine that have started playing with it. And, just clinically, yeah, it seems to be, but they're doing still all of the right things that you've just talked about as far as by implementing some of these other things doesn't mean you can, preclude what you need to do from a foundational standpoint. This is just additional frosting on that cake.
Yeah. I haven't used it, but it would be interesting to use. Years ago, I did a scar study where I looked at suture spacing, actually, like high density and low density, and found actually that low density suturing gives better scar outcomes than high density suturing. So I'm always looking for new projects for my fellows. And,
I'll send you some of the papers on it, and you can take a look at it. Bill, thanks so much. Let's talk about how the surgeons can get this into their hospital, their surgery center. What do they need to do? I mean, I know at our hospital system, it's a major deal to get it through the materials committee and all of that. So can you give us some direction?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options. Historically, what you would do is you would email us. You just email orders@sutureguard.com, and there's no U in SutureGuard. It's suturegard.com. So orders@sutureguard.com. And you can still email orders@sutureguard.com. It will always go to me. It'll go to Jen, who's my co-founder and wife. And then we can take it from there. So the easiest way is orders@sutureguard.com. I will also say that we have an exciting new partnership with Medline Unite. And so you may know of Medline Unite. Unite's one of the major, obviously everybody knows who Medline is. And Unite is a great, relatively new group within Medline selling orthopedic hardware. They're really growing. It's a great team, based out of Chicago there. I was actually there a couple of weeks ago with the team. So Medline Unite, for a lot of customers, Medline Unite might be the easiest way.
Okay.
Get with your local Medline Unite rep and say, hey, I want to try ASRD, or I want to try Interlock. I heard about it on Pod of Inquiry, and they'll hook you up.
Yeah, because they're connected with a lot of these committees already in the hospital system.
Yes.
So that obviates maybe a couple of hurdles that you would ordinarily have to go through. That's wonderful. And I'll make sure that's all in the show notes so that they can, click on that and get to you guys. Well, I loved learning more about your stuff. I want to thank you again for taking the time to come on this morning. And I'm sure this is going to be a very appreciated episode by everybody who's had a wound dehiscence.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And again, any of the listeners, reach out anytime.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This episode is sponsored by Zuckerman Future Technologies. Their REMI laser is a Class 4 laser for professionals. It's different from anything available on the market in that it is a lightweight, 4 pounds, and compact but powerful device. Its large touchscreen makes it easy to use, and the multiple wavelengths, 650, 810, and 980 nanometers, power variables up to 30 watts, and a safety rating make it optimal for many conditions, including the effective and pain-free treatment of soft tissue issues such as plantar fasciitis and Achilles tendinopathy, peripheral neuropathy, neuromas, arthritis, onychomycosis, warts, and more. It is the only laser with FDA 510K approval and insurance coverage. Zuckerman Future Technologies was built to focus on quality products and excellent customer support. When you join the REMI family, you will receive one-on-one training and ongoing support. Zuckerman Future Technologies deals with all aspects of the REMI in-house, and this keeps out the middleman, which allows them to offer this revolutionary device at a 40% reduced price compared to anything that can provide the same or similar results. In addition to this, Zuckerman Future Technologies provide a comprehensive, well-rounded marketing platform that includes customizable brochures and posters, in-office educational videos for your patients, as well as web page and hard copy ad templates. There are currently over 700 REMI users in the United States and Europe, and those numbers are rising every day. Learn more about this fantastic product and join the growing number of professionals who are benefiting from having the REMI in their practice. I personally implemented the REMI laser into our practice about 4 years ago, and I cannot say enough about the utility, versatility, and efficacy that I have seen with this technology. I also can say that of all of the capital equipment that I have purchased, and trust me, it's been a lot over the last 36 years, this is one of the best expenditures I have made. Zuckerman Future Technologies is offering the listeners of the Pod of Inquiry a really great deal. You'll get a $1,000 cart for the REMI laser when you use code 007. That's right, a $1,000 REMI laser cart for just the bona fide Pod of Inquiry spelunkers. You can go to the website, remilaser.com, and use the code 007.
We hope you all enjoyed today's show and got some truly empowering knowledge out of it. You can always follow up on anything we talked about in the show notes, found at our website, podofinquiry.com. If this incredible and educational conversation has tickled just a little bit of your cortex, please leave us a review and spread the message to your friends and colleagues. Let's keep spelunking.
This podcast is designed for informational purposes only and does not constitute any medical or surgical consulting advice or imply a development of any physician-patient relationship. The opinions of guests who are featured on the show are not necessarily the opinions of Dr. Barrett or the production team. This podcast is owned solely by Barrett Medical and Surgical Media, LLC. While the show is highly oriented for physicians and healthcare providers, anyone interested in the improvement of human performance and understanding will find this a welcome goblet to sip from, or guzzle. However, no representation or warranties are made in any way whatsoever on this podcast for any products, techniques, or other things discussed. Invited guests are not vetted by the Pod of Inquiry for their qualifications and may have a direct or indirect financial interest in what they present and discuss on the show. The Pod of Inquiry disclaims any responsibility from anything taken from the show and used personally or professionally. It is a responsibility of the listener to perform their own due diligence prior to the implementation of any ideas, products, techniques, or anything talked about on the show.